What's going on, folks? Ted from Nerd Immersion here, and I have a potentially controversial, spicy video. I don't know, whatever you prefer. But I had a conversation the other night with a friend of mine who also makes content, D&D content and things like that online, and we had some discussions about D&D streams and campaigns and things that you consume as content. And this is not necessarily you, the viewers of my channel, but it could very much be a coincide there, but also broad spectrum, just D&D content in general. And we decided that the kind of shows, right, that you watch, the streams you watch of people playing D&D, really fall, for the most part, into one or two camps, maybe three, and we'll talk about that, right? One is a show. It is a show. It is designed and worked to be a show. And by that I mean, and I'll explain, so don't get up in arms here, but by that I would mean something like Dimension 20 or Critical Role. They are shows. They are, granted, they are D&D campaigns, and there is a variety of, randomness, involving dice and things like that. Things maybe don't go the way things were planned, but they are put on as a performance, as a show. If we use Critical Role as an example, it is literally a group of actors, voice actors, but they are putting on a performance. Now, Matt will have a storyline and things like that, but a lot of the strength of the show aspect comes from the players acting, right? They are pulling off voice acting, which is, a lot of people are very talented in that, so I'm not going to say that nobody can do that at their own table, right? You can do all the funny voices that you want, but they are bringing another level, a non-typical level, I will say, of performance to the table because it is a show. People consume this show weekly as a form of entertainment. Same thing I would also argue with like Dimension 20 as well. It is designed, the stream and the game is designed as a show. I think there's a very big difference between me and you and three of our friends sitting down to play Dungeons and Dragons and saying, hey, let's play D&D. Okay, we're all going to play D&D. And then we're like, oh, hey, maybe we should stream it. And everybody's like, oh, yeah, cool. And then that's fine. And that's kind of the second camp that we're going to talk about. But if I say, like, hey, let's play D&D, and then we decide let's throw a camera in the room and play, okay, I think it's very different than saying, hey, I'm running a Dungeons and Dragons show. And then I feel like then there's possibly auditions, and you might be looking to, who you're going to involve, and it becomes more of a show. And then it's treated as such, right? You want to have not necessarily it needs to be this case, but like higher production quality. You want to make sure everybody has a microphone and knows how they're, and all these kind of, there's etiquette involved. And, maybe you do have set pieces or props, or people have long backstories that, and I'm not saying that you can't have any of these things with a smaller game, because you can, right? You can develop your own 6-page backstory for your home game or whatever the case may be. But I'm just saying, mentality-wise, there is something different, I think, than building a D&D show versus building a D&D campaign. Because the second camp, so we said the first camp is the ones that are designed as a show. And, if you were going to bring someone in to have them play in your D&D show that you're making, you're going to want those people to bring the effort, right? To put that extra effort in, to remain engaged, to not look bored, looking, if you're playing online, looking at other screens, doing other things on their phone. You want them active. You want them engaged. You want them to be aware of what's going on and, taking notes and doing all of the things, really bringing it, it out. Versus the second camp, which is what I would argue is the majority of Dungeons and Dragons streams or games you find online, which are almost akin to a voyeuristic experience in that a game of Dungeons and Dragons is happening and there's a camera observing it, right? So, like, for the most part, I would say, like, this is, you might have multiple camera angles and stuff zooming in on different players, but for the most part, the campaign that you are playing would be more or less the same were the camera's not there. You just decided to record it. So rather than a D&D show, this is a traditional D&D game, and then people are just watching. Okay? So, that's still going to be like flipping through books. Maybe we're looking through the different rules. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen on D&D shows, but it's a more traditional D&D experience. People are snacking at the table. People might go off on a side tangent about, something that they saw on TV, or they make a reference to a character that's in some form of popular culture, and then we have a little sidebar and we talk about this. Like what happens at an actual D&D game. It's also being streamed. And I guess if you want to consider third, maybe fourth camp, I would say kind of airs more, it's kind of a balance between the two, but has some form of audience interaction. And that sort of makes it separate, right? So while shows like Dimension 20, Critical Role, they happen and there's a chat, but the game would be largely, no, it wouldn't be different if you were there watching it live versus watching it 2 months later on, on YouTube or something like that. And in theory, depending on the situation, if it's the same way with the group that is basically just playing D&D and you're just watching it happen, then it would probably be the same. Whether you watched it live or watched it as a VOD later on, it's the same. So the third camp, I would say, could kind of lean either way, but I seem to think that they mostly fall in the middle, which is they are more of a show, but it is still more akin to a traditional D&D experience, but you have a direct interaction with the chat. The chat can impact the game, whether it be live, real time, or after the fact, but you know that if you're there during that game, something cool might happen and you might help make it happen. And I would use probably the Acquisitions Incorporated C-Team games as a better way to go about that, right? Where people can donate to add charges or do different things to impact the game overall. But this is a penny arcade thing. It's more higher production value. It is more of a show and has traditional D&D aspects as well. But the chat is there, so it kind of is a third one. And one that my friends, different group of friends brought up when we were talking about this subject too, was the concept of a podcast. And they love Dungeons and Daddies as one. I don't really do podcasts, but they were talking about it, and they said, they're writing the kind of like the adventures and stuff out, and they described it from like a script writing process, because a lot of the folks involved with that are writers. And they talked about how freeing Dungeons and Dragons is as a storytelling medium, because if you were to read this or watch some of these things as like a show, and then something funky happens, which could be the result, or positive or negative result of a die roll, it's not good like TV. So there's a third aspect, I guess, where you can talk about it from a writing perspective. But I guess the three camps are really what it comes down to. The show, the game, and the sort of in-between or something with chat interaction. And the reason I bring this up is I think there's a large difference between those three types of things, the audience for them, and then like what those audiences think they want. And let me explain. So the show, right, the Critical Roles of Dimension 20s, can be enjoyed by folks who don't even know anything about Dungeons and Dragons. Like, they don't have to play Dungeons and Dragons. They don't even have to necessarily be interested in Dungeons and Dragons, but they can enjoy the show as a form of entertainment. They might have questions. What's with the die roll? What's that mean? What's this mean? But if you watch long enough, you can kind of pick up what things are and what things people can do. And really, it ultimately, with the exception of the dice roll and the character sheets, kind of like an anime in some ways, right? Where like characters all of a sudden develop new powers out of nowhere. That happens like every couple of episodes in most shonen style animes, where you have your traditional protagonist who will get beat down and almost lose, and then they essentially level up and get a new power, and then it's a whole new game, and then we're in a new power level and we move on, right? You can enjoy that as a show regardless of your interest of Dungeons and Dragons. Or it could be a gateway for you to get into Dungeons and Dragons. And I feel like the people who like that as just a pure form of entertainment with no interest in the game, they fall into that category. And I feel like a lot of people say they want they want to watch the traditional D&D experience, right? Like the game. But I'm going to be honest with you, as someone who's ran games like that, ran streams like that, and observed a lot of other stuff, sometimes, you're scrolling through YouTube streams or Twitch streams, and you log into that, if you don't have like that kind of performance of the show type, it's hard to hook someone, right? If everybody's looking through their notes, or it's a shopping episode potentially, right? Obtaining and watching the true D&D experience is not something that the general masses like to watch. Now, there are some people who might love the characters or love the personalities that are playing, so they stick around. But for the most part, I feel like not a lot of people love to watch what I would call like that true voyeuristic traditional D&D experience, where people are sitting around a D&D table and playing a game, and there's a camera in the corner just observing them. You can hear everything fine, you can understand what's going on, but like I said, if the camera was off, the game is no different. But it's also interesting because, like I said, that game would happen the same whether you were there or not, but it's the same thing with the show, right? The show aspect. If you were there or not, the show still goes on. Whereas the middle camp is kind of maybe a blend of the two, but you being there live has unique opportunities for you to interact and to, depending on the size of the game, the size of the channel, maybe actually have direct conversations with the game. But that can also take away from the show aspect because you're breaking the immersion to talk to the chat. And it also takes away from the true D&D experience because you're breaking away from the game to address the chat. So I'm very curious because I don't know. I think, as someone who does content creation, as someone who streams D&D every week, we try to slot ourselves more into the central column, right? The central camp 3, where we try to have, role play and more character development and more fun show style content, while still sticking true to the rules for the people who enjoy that, because a lot of us in my games, we typically do like to play around with the rules, and there might be degrees of min-maxing and wanting to look cool and do cool things. But also we want to have the chat interaction because we want to be able to have that connection with the folks watching so that they can feel like they're part of the experience. And part of the difference there is that's the stream mentality, right? If you're a streamer and you're playing Fortnite, you're playing, Madden, whatever you're playing, right? An MMO, Pokemon, you're playing a game and you're streaming it. What makes it fun for a lot of folks is the chat's going, the chat's talking, and you're interacting. Maybe the chat makes a joke and makes, you do something silly, the chat calls you out on it. And that is what makes a stream where people come for the streamer. Because your personality, they're there for you because they like you. They want to watch what you do. So these folks, want to see what's going on. Some of them will only stay because you're playing the game they want to watch. But, if you do a good job building you as the streamer, people want to stay to observe you. So that's easier to do, I feel like, if you're playing a popular game or any game that people have nostalgia for or like the concept of, or you're just entertaining. And that's easier to do with you in a single-player game experience playing something. That's fine. But with a larger thing like a D&D campaign, there are other people involved, there's more going on, it's harder for people to possibly just jump in. But I come from a streaming background and, having done podcasting and, video game streaming and stuff like that. So I value the chat interaction piece of it because that's kind of what I know. Well, like I said, the show style and the traditional game style, the chat can be there or not, and it doesn't change anything. So ultimately, this is me just asking your opinion on a couple of things. One, which camp do you fall in? Do you bounce between the three? Do you only observe one or the other? Does one of them, now that I've brought it up and sort of called it out, does one interest you more than the other, or you think you'd like to dip into one versus the other? Now, again, I used Critical Role and Dimension 20 as two examples of what are traditional show-style things, and you may not like Critical Role or Dimension 20 at all, so me using them as an example means you don't like the show aspect. But think about it, if there's another D&D kind of thing that you watch that is more of a show, then it's a game, but they could be playing anything. You're basically watching a true performance of people playing, but it's very different than what I would call like the traditional experience. I don't know. But which one do you primarily watch? Have you watched the other ones, and what are your opinions on them? And what do you think the general, and I'm just curious because like I said, I think a lot of people say Like, oh, Critical Role is it's staged, it's made up, whatever the case may be. It's a show. I don't want to watch that. I want to watch people play D&D. I want to watch what actually happens. And I feel like people say that, but they really like the show aspect because it's easier to absorb as entertainment because it's entertaining and it has character development and plot development. So it, not to say that these games don't, but for the most part, you're playing a D&D campaign. Things happen. They get derailed. The party throws stuff off. And I'm not using this as a commentary for any of the stuff that I've done because I don't really know. Like I said, I try to stay in the middle, but I feel like a lot of the times we do veer more towards we're just people at a table playing D&D. And also, as we start to wind down some of the current campaigns that we have and we look to start new ones, I want to know where we should go in the future, which camp we should go to. You know, would you rather see us more ham it up? Not say ham it up necessarily, but, you know, really give a true performance while still sticking true to the rules, but more of a show performance? Would you like us to still have the chat interaction or lose it? So I'm very curious. I really don't know what to do, but this was I thought this was a good discussion topic to have, and I'm curious your thoughts on it. Please let me know in the comments down below. Maybe I'll do a YouTube poll as well and see what people think. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.